The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good morning everybody, and on behalf of Killarney Chamber of Tourism and Commerce, I'm delighted to welcome you to our third in a series of webinars. Today's webinar is entitled Employment and HR During and Post COVID-19. Our presenter today is Caroline McHenry, Managing Director with the HR Suite. Caroline is a HR and employment law expert, a past member of the Low Pay Commission, and currently an adjudicator in the Workplace Relations Commission. She holds a Master in HR from the University of Limerick, is CIPD accredited and a trained mediator. Prior to setting up the HR Suite in 2009, Caroline had worked across various areas of HR with Kerry Group and as Operation and HR Director with the Garvey Group. Please feel free to use the question box if you have anything you would like to ask Caroline, and my colleague Niall Gallagher will facilitate the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Following Caroline's presentation and Q&A, we will be joined by John Herlihy from Kerry ETB. John will spend approximately 15 minutes running through the relevant courses they have available in relation to the current crisis. Like last week, a recording will be taken of each webinar and will be subsequently available to download on our dedicated resource page on killarney.ie. So now it's my great pleasure to hand you over to Caroline.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be talking to you all this morning on the very topical area of HR. I'm delighted to have Niall as my co-pilot who's assisting with the slides. So basically, I suppose this morning's webinar, we're going to talk all things HR, and while Niall is popping up the slides, we basically just want to give you kind of what's topical. I would definitely encourage you to take advantage of the Q&A session. So if you have any queries, feel free to ask. I suppose the key things in terms of the options for employers is going to be the starting point. So the options for employers in terms of, you know, how do they manage this? A lot of employers have done phase one of this process up to now, and phase one is for some people meant that they put people on layoff, and layoff is basically when you pause the contract of employment, and basically the options available were the COVID payment of $350 or indeed the wage subsidy option also. So a lot of employers have done that at this stage in terms of which of those options they've had to look at. So short time is when you reduce the employee's wages from when they were on 5 days previously to 3 days or less. Layoff is when you pause the contract of employment when you have no work for them. And the third option is the wage subsidy scheme, which means people are still either working and you're getting the subsidy, or people are not working and you're getting the subsidy. So they're the options available to people. The current phase of where we're at is these schemes all are in place for 12 weeks. And as the 12 weeks comes to an end, there's been an indication that they will be tapered off at that stage. But obviously, certain industries, particularly tourism, hospitality, etc., may need support for longer, and that's been looked at for the moment. I suppose while people are off, it's really important that we still continue to communicate and keep those people updated in relation to what's happening from a business perspective, what's happening from a government perspective, etc. If people are on the wage subsidy, they can be doing training, they can be doing, you know, any other activities, they can be working on projects. For example, if you had, you know, specific projects that you could get people to work on while they're off. So while people are on the wage subsidy, even though you may not have specific ordinary work for them, you can be getting them to do other types of work as well. And obviously the wage subsidy is also in place for those that are working. Initially, when the wage subsidy came in, there was a lot of critique of it to say, well, is there revenue concerns associated with it? But I think Revenue have done very detailed Q&As to say that, look, once you can prove your business down at minimum 25% and you can show that the COVID-19 is the impact and cause of that, then you meet the criteria of that self-declaration. So I think it's very welcome now, and it's a very the schemes that are in place are working very well and very positively. The other thing to say is now I suppose we're looking at the return, and I'll talk to you more about that during my presentation, but ultimately I suppose that's the kind of next stage of that now that we need to consider. Just to mention as well, remote working has been a new norm for us now. A lot of companies went from working in offices or those types of jobs to working remotely pretty much nearly overnight. And for those companies that literally made that transition, they may not have had a remote working policy in place, or they may not have teased out the mechanics of how it would work thoroughly. So remote working is one of the big positives, I think, of this whole situation, and it's important, if you haven't already put in place a remote working policy or procedure, that you would do that at this stage. The other important thing about remote working is to do kind of a take stock now with people to identify what's working well and maybe what tweaks we might need to make remote working work better going forward, because it's not normal remote working, because people are finding that it's very challenging in terms of balancing child-minding responsibilities or balancing a number of people being in the house together, etc., which you wouldn't have if it was remote working in ordinary circumstances. So again, just to maybe reassess that, because we need to make sure people's working hours while they're on remote working are not in breach of any of the different legislations. We're finding a lot of people are saying, look, I'm getting emails at all hours of the night, and I feel that I'm not getting my downtime because of other people's work schedules. So again, as I say, a good time to maybe reassess what's working well and what might need to be tweaked around remote working. I mentioned, a lot of this happened and we had to react very rapidly to it. And only now we're starting to kind of step back to say, okay, well, there's a new norm here. But one of the important things, if you haven't already done it, is to review your COVID-19 policy for staff, because you would have had your contract of employment and you would have had your staff handbook in place already. But a number of the policies in your staff handbook are relevant to COVID-19, and it's good practice to bring them all together into one policy now in relation to COVID-19. And key things to consider in that COVID-19 policy are remote working, are flexibility in terms of hours, are employee obligations and employer obligations, because we still have a lot of businesses like retail and pharmacy and credit unions, etc., that are still operating. And for those that are operating, we need to make sure that we have included employee obligations around social distancing in relation to reporting any illness or feeling of unwell, and the procedure that they need to follow in that regard, in line with our health and safety obligations. So again, it's good practice to do that. Another area that's come up a lot has been, the need to check in with staff, and whether that's if they're working remotely or that they are on layoff or they're on short time, etc. So communicate more, because the importance of doing those regular check-ins and those communication updates are crucially important. And we're seeing that from an employee's perspective, even if the news isn't positive that they're getting from the employer, the fact that they are getting updates from their employers at this time is very welcome and is very reassuring for them. So try and make sure that you are doing regular updates. Particularly, we're expecting a government update now tonight. If there's any update in that, you're just letting staff know what's the implication of that. And if you're in a sector, for example, like tourism, where there's going to be no change for a while, you're still checking in with staff to say, we're just checking in to see how you all are. we're here if you need us or you need anything, and basically, you know, giving them well-being tips and advice in relation to looking after themselves at this time, because we're also finding that whether people are working remotely or that they're on layoff or short time, people are struggling a lot in terms of well-being at this time. So anything that you can do to assist in that regard as a very important you know, influencer on your employees still, I think is very important and very proactive. I suppose the next area I'd like to talk to you about is annual leave. And it has come up a lot in terms of one of the queries associated with whether people are on layoff or whether people are working, etc. So in relation to annual leave, when people are on layoff, there's no entitlement to accrue annual leave. However, if the employee does work the 1,365 hours, they will get a full 4 weeks pro rata to the hours they work. Same applies to short time, etc. I suppose it's important to ensure people are still taking and scheduling holidays if they are at work. We're finding that a lot of staff are saying, look, I don't want to take holidays because of the fact I've nowhere to go, you know, but we've an obligation from a rest and recuperation perspective that if people are working, for example, in the vital services, that we are still encouraging them to take holidays. You can give people 30 days notice of a requirement to take holidays, which a lot of companies are invoking. So they're basically contacting their employees to say, look, I need you to bring your holiday balance for the year up to date. And basically between now and the end of June, I need you to take your 2 weeks holidays to bring your holidays up to date. Because otherwise the concern is that you'll have a big bank of holidays for the second half of the year, which will present financial challenges, but also challenges in terms of, you know, trying to facilitate holidays. So again, try and maybe get an assessment of where your holidays at the moment for people, and maybe start using this time to plan holidays proactively. The other thing to remember is public holiday entitlement for the first 13 weeks of layoff applies. So that's just important to know also. So moving on then, I suppose we touched on health and safety as being one of our key obligations, and we always say health and safety trumps everything else, but that is hugely important and never more so now. And your legal obligations are that you need to do a risk assessment of the work environment and do everything you can to reduce or eliminate any risks that are present. So continuing to do those risk assessments as this pandemic continues is very helpful. So for example, when you do your risk assessment, you might have decided in line with government recommendations, etc., that you need your staff to work remotely. But now in planning them to return, you may need to put further distance, for example, between desks. You may need to, you know, put in place other measures. So again, you're doing your risk assessment to identify what are the risks, and then you're identifying how you can reduce or eliminate those risks. And we're seeing differing advice coming from the HSE and from people like Professor Sam McConkey in relation to PPE and what's, you know, advisable and what's necessary, etc. So that's why on a case-by-case basis, you should do your own risk assessment to kind of map the customer and the staff journey and the touch points in terms of social distancing. And we know that the two key things around social distancing and good hand hygiene and good cough etiquette, but particularly good hand hygiene and social distancing, are crucial to managing this virus. So again, what health and safety considerations you need to think about. The other category under health and safety to consider is any vulnerable workers that you may have. So for example, pregnant employees, employees who have underlying health conditions, etc. So again, you need to decide how you're going to manage that in line with your health and safety obligations, because we now know that this isn't a short-term pandemic. This is going to be going on for quite a while, and we need to assess in line with that long-term view now, how we address those matters. But health and safety is something that, again, keep your paper trail. We always say in HR, you know, if it's not in writing, it never happened. So ensuring you have a really good paper trail by keeping all your risk assessments, by ensuring that if you have conversations with staff in relation to, for example, vulnerable employees, etc., that you again do follow-up emails afterwards to confirm what you've discussed and agreed. So again, you're very proactively ensuring that you've managed the situation as best you can in line with health and safety obligations. So I suppose moving on then to I suppose a return phase for some businesses. I suppose the whole focus here is in terms of, you know, addressing the kind of updates and the communication as you go along. We're finding that for some businesses who've had to bring staff back in for whatever reason, staff are saying, well, actually, I'm happy out. I prefer to be out because I'm getting my 350 and I feel safer for whatever reason. So again, it's important to plan your return and do your expectation structuring well in advance in that regard. And in your town hall updates, whether they're a conference call that people dial in or whether you're sending an email, you know, whatever that update is, again, letting people know that, you know, our hope is that people will be returning and this is the timeline, etc. in that regard is very important. So again, keep the expectation structuring in place because, again, a lot of that is going to be dictated by government guidelines. It's going to be dictated by how the pandemic, you know, behaves itself when we start to go back to what is a new normal. And again, there may be elements of that. The other thing to remember is you need to select people to return in line with business requirements as you did when you had people going out. So again, in terms of how you do that, make sure you communicate that proactively, make sure you do your written follow-up, and again, make sure that you're considering the team and the team activities and the team approach, because we know that staff members will be communicating, and rightly so. We want to make sure that it's fair, it's transparent, and we can stand over it objectively, which is the legal requirement in this regard. So again, just to keep that in mind as you manage that return, because for many people it won't be a case that they're coming back potentially on a full-time basis to start. It may mean that there is a soft phase return where somebody who was working 5 days might be starting to work remotely 2 days and come into the office 3. But again, it's how you manage that with the health and safety considerations. Or for the restaurant, you might decide that you're going to open to facilitate takeaways or, you know, home delivery, etc. Then you might say, well, actually, I only need, of my 10 staff, I actually only need 4 now. So again, how am I going to communicate that to everybody, and how am I going to manage that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, you know, before we finish today. So moving on then, in terms of the business restructure, or what does the new business look like? For a lot of organizations, they're realigning their business structure in line with what is the new business look and feel, and I suppose need in terms of innovation and survival. And, you know, a number of things are being considered in that regard. So some businesses are going to go through a transfer of undertakings in terms of 2-pay legislation, which means that smaller businesses may merge, may be sold, etc. And again, all normal employment legislation is still in, I suppose, still in place. So again, that normal 2-pay will happen if that is to occur. We're finding that businesses are looking to outsource some roles that they had in-house previously. Obviously, marketing, HR, things like that are being considered in terms of outsourced now, because businesses are saying, well, I can't afford, or I mightn't need a full resource in-house, and maybe I need to outsource. So that's something we're seeing happening more. We're also having discussions with clients where they're saying, look, we need to implement a wage reduction or hours reduction, which in effect is going to bring the wage bill down as well. Remember, if you're doing a wage reduction or you're doing a change in terms of people's hours more longer term, that is a change in terms and conditions and requires you to go through that consultation and that agreement phase to ensure that there's no retrospection afterwards, that employees can say they didn't agree to that. In terms of redundancy, the layoff legislation, layoff and short-term are both short-term measures for a company to take. And for a lot of employers, they would have people on layoff at the moment. Currently, Pascal Donoghue introduced legislation to pause that phase of the piece of legislation in terms of where employees can invoke redundancy, and that currently is paused until the 21st of May. However, we expect that that'll probably be extended at least till September. It isn't done at the moment, but currently the employer can still consider redundancy in terms of, for example, businesses who might be now making a decision to say, look, I don't see a place for us and we're thinking we won't reopen, or indeed, look, that role or that department isn't going to form part of the new business structure because that offering is no longer there. Remember, with redundancy, it's always the person is irrelevant to the situation. It's all about the position. So it's not the person you make redundant, it is the position. And again, redundancy is a termination of employment, and you need to make sure you follow the proper process, especially in relation to selection for redundancy, if that is something that you feel you need to do. But the hope is, with the wage subsidy and the layoff, etc., options available, that we won't need to do redundancies. But unfortunately, it is something that for some companies that will form part of that business restructuring canvas that they will need to look at. So I suppose to kind of conclude, in terms of, you know, what to do now, I suppose my first piece of advice would be to make sure that you continue to do your risk assessments in terms of health and safety, and make sure you document those and look at them based on that moment in time. What are the health and safety considerations you need to consider? What are the risks presented in your business, and how have you either reduced or eliminated them? Second of all, if you don't have a COVID-19 staff policy in place, I would recommend you do one, where you're updating staff in relation to absence, in relation to reporting, in relation to home working, in relation to layoff, in relation to all those different measures. So again, put your policy in place, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to dictate how we act as a company, and it's a really good reference point for both employers and employees to ensure that everybody is consistently applying those policies accordingly. The next thing I would say is cut your cloth to measure in terms of your approach to this. Identify what is your business strategy, and then align your HR strategy to that. So identify what does the future look like in terms of both short and longer term. I would say if you're implementing any changes, so that might be changes in terms of working hours, or changes in terms of a wage reduction, or changes in whatever, make sure you follow the correct legal process in that regard to ensure that, you know, you are making the decision and there's no comeback because you've done it properly, rather than there being potential morale issues or potential employment law claims after this. And make sure, as I say, we've a brilliant opportunity from an employee perspective to really be good employers and show good leadership by empathetically doing what we need to do, and how you do it is so important, and making sure we do that in an empathetic and a kind way, and as visually as we can, is very important. I would also say communicate, and communicate more. The importance throughout this whole process of communication, both for vital workers who are currently still working, and for those that are either on layoff, short time, or you know, any of the other different changes in terms of working hours. So make sure you keep the communication channels opened, and you're doing both individual updates for people if there's changes from their perspective, or indeed group updates in relation to what's happening from a company point of view, because in the absence of getting those communications and those updates, we're finding that you have a lot of people who are, you know, worried and stressed further in relation to their job or in relation to their career or their future. And I appreciate for employers and business owners, it's a very stressful, it's a very challenging time. But even if your update is, lads, we don't know what's happening in our sector, and we'll have to wait another couple of weeks before we get more guidance from the government, that's an update. So just keep people updated. And I think based on the government update tonight, it's good timing to do a staff update either tomorrow or Tuesday, depending on when you get around to doing it. I think it would be good practice to do that. And the final, I suppose, what to do now is to make sure that from a well-being point of view, you're doing all you can to check in with people at this time, because we know that people are struggling because they're not alone, worried in relation to financial concerns, health worries for themselves or their family, but also in relation to kind of what does the new normal look like. So try and touch base and check in with your staff in that regard also. And I would say, like, there's a lot of tough business decisions being made at the moment, and they've a huge impact in terms of what the HR steps and processes that you need to follow are. But sometimes you just need to press pause and, you know, think it through, and then maybe get some advice if you feel that's helpful. But either way, you know, I suppose take your time in doing it and make sure you do it as, you know, as correct as you can, keeping into consideration all of the points that I've outlined. So that's kind of a rapid fire buzzer. I want to ensure there's time for questions. So Niall is going to facilitate Q&A based on the questions that you've been sending in, and I'll add in a few more points if we have time at the end then. So Niall, I'll let you maybe go through the questions and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Caroline. So I suppose anybody that wants to come in and ask a question, there's two methods. One is hands, and I can patch you in to ask Caroline real time, or you can ask a question in the question bar. So thank you very much for that, Caroline. Very informative. So I just see Orna O'Mahony. So Orna, if you want to come in there.
No, I'm okay, Niall, at the moment, sorry. Thanks.
No problem, thanks. I'm just seeing anyone that have hands up. Okay, we don't. So Caroline, we don't have any questions in at the moment, but I suppose in relation to that perspective, and I suppose employers who are now making a decision that, look, their business isn't going to continue or open post-COVID-19, obviously they have maybe not made that decision or communicated that decision yet, or maybe in the process of making that decision and weighing up their options. So I suppose what's the best advice you could give to those people?
I think because we have the 12-week measures in place, there's no urgency in terms of, you know, a lot of people are on layoff, so at least you've got a bit of time to make sure that you're happy you're making the right decision. I would say, once you've made your decision, be aware of what are the redundancy guidelines. So is it a collective redundancy, or is it going to be individual redundancies, etc.? I think that has to be considered, and then basically get some advice and guidance, because you are going through a termination of employment in relation to how you handle that. I suppose we operate on an hourly rate basis. So you don't sign up for years or any of that kind of stuff. And we have a 2-hour consultation available for people, which is €200, because for a lot of people, they've never done this before, and it's uncharted waters. And the whole idea is that you just need somebody to literally take you through that and just give you some guidance in that regard. But I would say if you're doing a termination and you're considering closure, etc., that you should consider that, because it's such an important phase to get right, I suppose.
Okay, now we just have a few questions coming in there. First, okay, retaking people off COVID payment and transferring them onto the wage subsidy scheme. So people that have been on the COVID and coming on to your wages payroll again.
So that's been encouraged is the first thing, because the government want as many people on people's payroll as they can to keep the connection with the employer. Is there a specific question, Niall, about that?
So I think they were looking for outline, but there's actually another one. So is it possible to transfer an employee from COVID-19 social welfare to J9, which it is? And
it is, and it's being encouraged. The biggest challenge we're finding, Niall, is that the employee at the minute who is on the COVID payment is getting a flat 350 payment. And if you have somebody who is earning less than that ordinarily, when they transfer to the wage subsidy scheme, they will only be getting what they're on the wage subsidy scheme. And obviously employers are being encouraged to top it up, but to top it up to a maximum of what they normally are being paid. So for a lot of employees, they don't want to transfer over to the wage subsidy scheme for that reason, because they might have only been getting €100 before and now they're getting 350. So that's a challenge, and it's I suppose it's an anomaly with the scheme, but because the government had to introduce something so quickly with so many people, they didn't have the resources to do the calculations pro rata to what people were being paid, where they have done that for the wage subsidy scheme.
Okay, and that leads me to the next question. As the people that are on either the wage subsidy or the COVID and reducing their hours and the implications of that.
So if people are on the COVID payment, they are on layoff. So that means they're not working at the moment. So if you're taking them off COVID to bring them back, for example, they were doing 5 days and now you're bringing them back to do 3, for example, then they would move from the COVID payment to the short time option, and they would get compensated in relation to the 2 days you don't have work for them. But that's social welfare rates, which is approximately €80 for the 2 days, not the COVID payment. For those that are on the wage subsidy scheme, for most employers, because they're getting 70% of what you're, approximately 70% for everybody, depending on the rates that they're on. For most employers, then they're getting people, for example, to take holidays, you know, to bring them to the 5 days if they were doing 5 days before. But you absolutely, as you're planning to go forward, you can decide what does my business need. And as well, for social distancing, people are doing a team A, for example, and a team B. Team A work Monday and Tuesday, for example, and Wednesday morning, and then the team B work Wednesday afternoon and Thursday and Friday, again to facilitate social distancing and business continuity planning in that regard. So there's definitely a lot of changes in terms of hours, and you can do what you need to do. And again, I think for a lot of people, they've done maybe the first phase of this, but they're thinking now, what do I need to do for the next phase, which is important to be thinking about now.
Okay, so Michelle O'Sullivan Darcy, I think you have your hand up there if you want to ask Caroline.
Caroline, I'm here. Hello, good morning. Caroline, our question, we're hoping to be optimistic. We were hoping to be back to work next Tuesday, but I don't know, all the indications are that it looks unlikely. But our employees are on the wage subsidy scheme, but they're worried that revenue are going to come back and hammer them over tax by the end of the year. And we're trying to say to them, look, it's all a new process. We're availing of the subsidy. We're just trying to keep the teams in place so that we're ready to go when we can. How do you answer that fear? And when they come off the very first week we get back to work, and they go from being J9 to week 1, what are the tax implications for all of them?
So I suppose while they're on the wage subsidy scheme, a lot of my clients have put people on, they've suggested that they go to the revenue themselves and put themselves on a week 1. So that will address the issue of a tax bill at the end of the year, for want of a better word. The revenue are very aware the fact of the tax concerns, and they've said that they're going to manage that in terms of keeping it, you know, as light as possible for people. So if, for example, people have a liability, then they'll, you know, plan that over a period of time with the person. So it's publicly known that people will have a tax issue, because Revenue have said that they will remedy any anomalies by the end of the year for the wage subsidy scheme. But I think all you can do is explain everybody's in the same boat. There's 500,000 people on that wage subsidy scheme now, so they have to manage it in a proactive way. And I think they will, and they're indicating that very much to be the case, Michelle. So I think that's as much consolation you can give them, but I think that should be hopefully welcome consolation.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. So Caroline, just 2 more questions here now. One is, when the emergency legislation ends, can an employee claim redundancy if their hours are cut?
So if once the piece of legislation that is paused at the moment basically means that if you as an employer on layoff, you can request to be put back on full-time hours and full-time work. And if the employer can't give you that commitment within 4 weeks, that they have 13 weeks solid work for you, then basically they're entitled to claim redundancy. So that's the criteria that's in the legislation at the moment. And when Pascal Donoghue paused that, he said, I'm not changing the legislation, that will still remain, I'm just pausing that clause. So we expect that that's the clause that will be put back in. However, I do expect, particularly for hospitality, I do expect that they will extend that pausing until at least September, because we know for a lot of tourism and hospitality businesses, I'm doing a lot of work with Fall to Ireland, and we have a lot of clients in that sector, that we know that realistically for some of those businesses, they need it extended longer than the 21st of May for that reason. So I would hope that that will address that listener's concern by it being extended.
Okay, just I've people with their hands up here now, and one more question. What is the situation with annual leave entitlement in 2020? If and when we are back to work, do we still have to give the full 20 days?
So the answer is if the person works more than 1,365 hours in that year, and your holiday year can be April to April or can be a calendar year. So if they work more than the 1,365 hours in that year, then they're entitled to their 4 weeks pro rata to the hours they work. So if I work 20 hours, I get my 4 weeks at 20 hours. If I work 40 hours, it's 4 weeks at 40 hours. If they don't meet that criteria, it's 8% of the total hours that they work. So that's how holidays are calculated.
Brilliant. So look, I know you're under pressure. You have another webinar at 11 o'clock, and we just have Conor Hinnigan here, so I'll leave Conor with the last word. Conor, do you want to come in there?
Morning, Caroline. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation.
Yeah.
I suppose just maybe a slightly awkward one. I know from talking to clients, some businesses are saying, will we or won't we open this year? And it all depends on obviously the announcement, possibly later today. But from a tourism point of view, you know, firstly you have to say if the announcement comes that hotels can open up, let's say, on a certain date, and depending on when that date is, it may not be feasible for some businesses to actually open this year. If that is the case, and people are thinking about saying, well, if I don't open my business and I plan for 2021, what are the implications for that business, and particularly what are the implications for employment? Where do you see that going, Caroline? I know it's a difficult scenario, but you know, it could mean that you would be forced into redundancy situations for employees. Or, you know, there's the other thing is that if you want to retain employees, do you think there'll be any subvention going forward?
Okay, so I suppose it's a difficult question, but it's one we're dealing with every day currently, to be honest with you. It's the phase we're in now where people have done the short-term measure and now they're trying to identify, well, what am I going to do in terms of the business strategy going forward? I would say that once you identify what you're going to do, I think we have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. For a lot of businesses, they've had staff with them years and years, and the consultation with staff, what we're finding is, like, whether I've been talking to hotels in Listowel, Varna, or in Killarney, or in other parts of the country, for some businesses, those people are with you for years and they're willing to weather the storm with you. And even if that means that they won't have work for the rest of the year, that's okay. Whereas for other businesses, the employees are saying, I want my money so I can stay back in the country, you know, that I'm after relocating to for my pandemic, or actually I want to go somewhere else and get a job in a hotel that's open. So I think there's no one size fits all. I think the government will extend the redundancy clause in the legislation. Definitely, I think until September, but again, that hasn't been done, so that's speculation. But based on my engagement at the levels I've been involved in, that's what it's indicating. And it may need to be extended longer than that. I think also that, you know, for some businesses, they're not going to reopen at all. It's not just going to be for the season. They've decided that the cost model that they have and the cash flow situation that they're in, actually the business model isn't viable for me to reopen, and now I need to reassess the situation. So I think we need to take each case on a case-by-case basis, and remember, employment law is still in place if you need to go down any of those roads. And I think, you know, making kind of the right decision for the business and then identifying what are your best options around that. And I think we're seeing a lot of, I suppose, lobbying of the government from different sectors, but there's a lot particularly of concern as to how we're going to support hospitality, because it is expected that 2020 is going to be a very challenging year. But on a positive, there's also a lot of very strong indications that Ireland is seen to be a very safe country. Obviously, Killarney is a huge advantage in that regard in terms of all the beauty, the outdoors, etc. So it is expected that when things do return, that, you know, people will be looking to go to places that are particularly seen as safe and outdoorsy, etc. So we're hoping that once we weather this storm, that 2021 is going to be a much better place. But I do think it's realistic to say for some businesses, you know, that mightn't be possible to weather the storm for that long. All right.
Thanks, Caroline. Just one quick final question that came in here. Are there any specific outlines that must be put in place around temporary reductions in pay, for example, an estimated timeline or targets, etc.?
There's an unlawful deduction. If you just tell somebody that you're reducing their pay, for example, that's an unlawful deduction of somebody's wages. So again, you'd need to check what does the contract clause say in relation to wages and reductions, etc. And then likely you will have to agree that with the staff member. Now, we're in a situation where people have had very severe cuts, you know, to their pay, and people have accepted them because they know that if they don't, realistically, the other alternative is worse. So again, make sure you follow the correct process. There's no requirement in terms of period of time or review, but you would normally build that in. So you would be saying, again, to ensure you get the agreement, you'd normally say, well, look, we're asking you to take a pay cut for the next 6 months, and then we'll review it again in January. But the agreement of what you're agreeing to now is that you agree for the next 6 months, and then we get agreement and we document that. And generally the document, you know, is going to be an email to confirm what we've discussed and agreed. But without doing that, I suppose you're leaving yourself open. And all of you will know from managing people and dealing with people, everything's grand in HR when everything's grand. but when an issue occurs, like employment law is designed to protect employees. So make sure, I suppose, as an employer, you're aware of your obligations and you follow them. And once you do the paper trail, then you don't need to worry after that. All right.
Caroline, thank you very much. I know you're going to another webinar now. You had a slide there with your contact details, which I couldn't share because I was doing the questions. So I'll ensure we'll get that around to all the attendees that they can contact you if they want, if they have any further thoughts in relation to it. So thank you very much for your time. And
thank you.
Look, these are things we're going to do again. So maybe if there's a need on a specific employment issue or that regard, we'll be in contact again. And thank you very much again for your time.
My pleasure, Niall. And I suppose I really appreciate, to be fair to Killarney Chamber and businesses, you're very good to support us in the HR suite, and we really appreciate the business. And if anybody needs me, even just as a quick call at any stage, I'd be more than delighted to help, anybody, because we are in uncharted waters, and as I say, only glad to help. I appreciate the support. So take care. Have a good long weekend, everybody. Thank you for listening. Take care. Hope you found it beneficial. Take care.
Thanks, Caroline. So I'll just pass you over now to John Hurley from the Kerry College of Further Education. And John will take you through what the Kerry College are doing at the moment. It could be very, very relevant for your staff that are currently not working, of courses that may be important for when we all get back to work. So John, over to yourselves there now.
Thanks a million, Niall, and good morning to everybody. It's nice to be here, and hope you're doing well. Very interesting talk there from Caroline. Very interesting and very relevant. And as she mentioned, we are very much in uncharted waters in the education and training sector as well. As you may know, we've had to close our physical businesses. Our physical campuses are closed. Our offices are closed. And we're looking for new and innovative ways to try and assist the business community and the wider community. And there's a lot going on about that at the minute. I want to just update you, I guess, on the first instance. And the second instance is just to let you know that we're here to help. I'd like at the end of this very brief presentation this morning to send out a link for a 60-second survey just to see what your needs are at the minute, your immediate and long-term needs are in terms of training and support, because I'll use that to go back and talk to our management teams about providing stuff that's more targeted. Okay, so just, I suppose, first of all, we're here to help. Despite being closed, we are open for applications. This is more of a long-term thing. We do 3 strands of programs in Kerry College. One is courses for employment, which are courses to get people into work. The second are courses for college progression. And college progression really is up in the air at the minute. Universities are talking about starting in September, October, November. Sometimes they're talking about January. It's very up in the air. And a bit like the announcement today, people are waiting to see what the story is after the lifting of restrictions and the long-term view of the Department of Education and Skills. So we're very much waiting on that information as well. And the third stream then is apprenticeship, and which has been traditionally very strong for us, but now it's sailing into very uncertain times again, because we're not entirely sure if the employers that had apprentices would be in a position to take them back when things ramp up again. So in terms of Kerry College, and all of the courses are available on our website at kerrycollege.ie. We do full-time, part-time, and apprenticeship. It's a new site. It's relatively easy to navigate, and the information is very simple. So it's a good resource, and I'd advise you to go in your own time and have a look at what we do, bearing in mind that a lot of these courses will intake later in the year. So that's the long-term thing. The short-term thing in terms of yourselves then is that we recently launched an online program in infection prevention and control. It's a QQI level 5. It's done completely online. There are some practical tests which you video and send upload through our e-learning management system, and that you get an immediate grade and certification shortly after that. We would think that this course is probably something that, without overstating it, almost everybody will need to do at some point in the next couple of months. It's totally free. There are no charges on this to anybody. Anybody can do it. It's not just for HSE staff. We get lots of queries about that. And you can apply for it online via our website. I'll send around the direct link later, just so you guys can go in and have a look at it. We've put through about 250 people so far. It's been absolutely huge. We're getting a huge amount of applications, but because of the online nature of the program, we'll be able to deliver to large bunches of, we're taking in 50 at a time, and we're working through our list that way. So that's one thing that's very relevant, and we just feel it has probably a wider societal impact as well. Not just for the obvious businesses, but infection prevention and control is going to be one of the big things as we move forward and emerge from this COVID epidemic. We've teamed up with the HSE and we're doing Principles of Hygiene and PPE, which is a closed course for HSE staff. It's 3 hours delivered via distance, social distancing, which is challenging for us. We can only take, just to give you, I'm including this as an example of how difficult it is to deliver skills training at the minute. We're taking in groups of 3, would you believe, with an instructor, and using social distancing within our classroom, delivering skills training that way. It's very difficult to work through it. We have a number of instructors on it, but we're getting there. It's just so challenging at the minute. But that should give you an update in terms of how we're engaging with like the HSE. We've been in touch this week as well with Kerry County Council, and we're part of the new interagency task force that's being set up there. And we're working on a Stay Safe program that is geared specifically for the hospitality sector. And we're currently working on that. And we will be in touch with all of the chambers and all of the business sectors relating to that. When that's ready. And that should be, I won't say it's going to be ready this week or next week, but we're currently working on it. And we'll be back with word on that. That will be a fully online program as well, with maybe some social distanced training element to it as well. But it's going to be mostly online. We're also setting up in Kerry College, I was talking to our manager, our campus manager this morning there, a COVID-19 local business response team. And that's currently being set up and being led out. And the idea there is to specifically support the business sectors in Kerry at this time, providing training that might be very difficult to get, very expensive to buy, very expensive to license, or just that isn't there. So we might just kick the ball off on that a little today with that short survey at the end, and I'll feed that back to the COVID-19 local business response team and get the ball rolling in terms of what people are thinking in the business sector on the grounds in Killarney. Other programs, just to mention them, we have an Explore program for IT and digital literacy skills. That's staff that are quite poor in terms of their IT and digital literacy, and you feel that it would hamper their abilities if they had to look for new jobs, but they wouldn't have the skills level to actually go and apply for jobs. It's a really, really big issue, and we find that it's a lot more prevalent than you would think. So I'm going to give you contact details at the end of the presentation today in terms of who you can link in with about that. The program is free, and we provide free IT as well as part of that. So you get a tablet or a laptop, and this is not, people say to me, this must be a catch on this. There isn't. There isn't a catch on it. You do get an actual laptop or a tablet free as part of this program, because the thinking behind it, it's a national program, is that you need the IT device to develop your skills. A classroom environment 2 or 3 times a week is not going to work. So that's the Explore program, just to let you know about that. You may know about eCollege, you may not. eCollege is a repository of online courses that are normally only available for job seekers, which means you've got to be on social welfare. eCollege is now free for the foreseeable future. There's a range of excellent courses on there. The website is ecollege.ie. But in terms of your staff, we can assist you in doing batch registration. So if you've got 10 or 15 or 20 or even more people that want to do specific types of courses, instead of you going through all of the hassle of getting these guys to register in their own time, we can organize batch registrations for you with our colleagues in eCollege, because it's all part of Solus. But again, just to go through the website at ecollege.ie and have a look. Any queries, you can address them to us. There's no problem. We're working on a number of new programs at the minute. They're all online. Some of them are business related in terms of business leadership. Others are in terms of supporting staff. And we'll be in touch with all the chambers when they're ready. But just to let you know about that. Skills to Advance is another program that has been running, which provides very targeted support to the business sector, but the intakes on those courses is going to be later in the year, unfortunately. So if you see that online, you can certainly get in touch with us, but the intakes are going to be more linked to traditional education and training, which is later in the year, which again is a pity. We're very frustrated about it, but unfortunately, it's just the new reality of education and training in this country. What I would say as well is that the education piece is pretty easy to deliver online, within reason. But skills development is very challenging, and that's something that we've never been able to really crack to this point, but it's something that we're looking into, how to deliver effective skills training online. Very few people have managed to do it in the online learning sector, and we're looking into that at the minute. So in terms of contact, CGA contact, in terms of employer engagement, the person to contact there is Sharon Brown, my colleague in Kerry ETB. That's her email. I'll circulate those slides afterwards, and that's her work mobile number, so you can give her a ring at any time. and she'll be able to assist you in terms of further information about any of the employer-led programs. If you have any other questions, you can certainly contact me, and I'll be able to find the right person to link you to so you can get a result. So that's my own number there and my email if you have any queries at all. I was trying to keep this really brief. I have a link for a 60-second needs survey for the business sector in Killarney. I'd love to email that afterwards, if that's okay, Niall, and we'll collect your responses across the next couple of days. It's only 3 or 4 questions, but we'd love to see what's happening on the ground in Killarney. We'd have an idea, but nothing beats hearing from the business sector themselves up front. So I'd really appreciate if you took that 60 seconds and completed that survey for us. It would allow me to feed that back to the COVID local business response team. Okay, so that's it. I wanted to keep it really brief. Niall, thank you so much for inviting me in. And can I just say as well that Killarney looked really good in the news in the last week. Not good insofar as the town was very empty, but it was great to see people like Paul on there and Ollie from the Shire, and I think you were on TV3 and RTE, so whoever's behind that, well done. It's good to keep that level of prominence there for the town.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much. And look, we don't have a time for a question and answer session, but I think it was important to get in what you have to offer in Kerry College for staff and for people at this time, e-college as well. So I'll hand you over to Paul and look at your presentation, and that link for the survey will be sent out to the members today. Thank you.
Appreciate it, and thank you, Niall. Thank you.
Now, Paul, over to you.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Niall. John, thanks for that. That was superb, and also to Caroline, very engaging. We'll be making our way out to Hollywood, I suppose, after the events of this week, John. But thanks for mentioning that. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us today. Hope you found the information useful and engaging. Certainly, there's a lot of information there from both presentations, and we're back again next week at 11 a.m. Next week, webinar will be facilitated by Helen O'Leary from the Innovate Room Consultants. The webinar will focus on preparing your plans to reopen your business, preparing for our new normal, and reimagining a new sales landscape. This will be a more in-depth look at the sales and marketing area, and will be of interest to the hospitality sector and sales and marketing teams. So that's next week at 11 a.m. Following the presentation next week, Sarah Tracy is going to join us at 12 p.m. from OCKT, Chartered Accountants and Registered Auditors. She's going to talk to us about formulating business plans, which is very, very relevant at the moment for anybody looking at the microfinance and the SCBI. So that'll be Sarah next week at 12 o'clock. So once again, thanks for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you all next week at 11 o'clock. Thanks a million. Thanks. Bye-bye.